Sanse, welcome to Soul Medicine, Ancient Psychologies for Wellness. I am your host, Dr. Carly Fellner, psychologist and member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. As always, feel free to pick up what fits for you and to leave what doesn't. I'm just here to present a different way of understanding mental health and wellness. This podcast is not intended to provide or take the place of professional advice. If you or someone you know is in need of mental health supports, please reach out to one of the many resources available in your area or to a trusted professional. Psycholonization refers to all of the ways that colonialism is enforced and reproduced through the psy-disciplines, psychology, psychiatry, and beyond. I encourage listeners to think about where their ancestors come from to the best of your knowledge, with that acknowledgement that some people won't know due to processes of adoption, different forms of disconnection. There's many reasons people may not know where their ancestors come from. The piece of exploring who we are or where our lineages go back to is that remembering that all of us are Indigenous to some place or places on this planet. Now, I want to be really clear here. This isn't a path to co-opt an Indigenous identity, because indigeneity is contextual and related to place and related to dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression. The purpose in putting this forward is to encourage people to connect back to: where did your ancestors come from? What lands were they connected into? And even if you don't know, just knowing that your ancestors were Indigenous to some place and places on this planet, and that at one time they lived in accordance with our original instructions. What the crow was talking to Iskotew about in episode 1 in the story that I shared. All of us had ancestors at one time that lived in accordance with natural law and in principles of good relationship with land and place and with all of our relations of the natural world and the cosmos. For some of us, we may be thousands of years removed from those ways of living and those knowledges, whereas folks who are Indigenous here today still have those knowledges, still have those understandings, those ceremonies, those ways of being in relation. The importance of this all comes back to what I had shared in episode 1 about how the fundamental principles of Indigenous psychologies understand that we are land, that we are interconnected with the land, and that there is no way around that. All of our ancestors understood that. It's just a question of how many generations back was that? Is that current, something that we still understand for those who are Inuit Indigenous peoples today? And then there's some folks who were disconnected from those understandings thousands of years ago. Colonialism has taken place globally. There are different areas of the world that have been colonized by different empires at different times in different ways. Regardless of where the colonialism happened, who the empire was, common themes in colonialism are about power, control, and domination. The colonialism that has taken place in what today is known as North America took place primarily on behalf of the British Empire, also the French and the Spanish. And when you look back in that history before the 15th century, there was all kinds of colonialism that was going on in what we now know today as Europe before the British came over here and were colonizing. I remember visiting Edinburgh Castle in Scotland about 15 years ago and seeing all kinds of displays on language nests and cultural revitalization, ceremonial revitalization that the Celtic people were doing there. It really struck me in that moment because it was that reminder of, wait a second, the people who live here were colonized before our Inuit Indigenous peoples of what's now known as North America were colonized. Colonialism has a lineage. And just looking at what are the intentions of colonialism? What were they thousands of years ago? What were the intentions of the Roman Empire? What were the intentions of the British Empire? What are the intentions of colonialism today and the ways that neo-colonialism is manifesting? There are other people who can do a much better job of delving into the history and lineages of all of these empires than I can. My focus here today is to talk about what are the ways that colonialism manifests within our current mental health system, and what purposes does that continue to serve in those dominating colonial systems and structures today. So it can be helpful when you do know where your ancestors come from, or even have a sense of where they may have come from, thinking into how long ago were they colonized and disconnected from their roots. One of the primary aims of colonialism is to disconnect us from our power, or at least give us the sense that we don't have the power that we actually do have. A big part of that is actually found within these systems of pathologizing, or in other words, telling people that there's something wrong with them, because when somebody takes that on as part of their identity, that, oh, there's something wrong with me, I can't do that because of my depression, I can't do that because of my anxiety. It's very disempowering. It tells us that we are somehow incapable, that we are not a fully functioning, well human being. From Inuit Indigenous understandings, we are all whole, perfectly well human beings behind whatever it is that's getting the best of us in that moment. Whatever those conversations are that are coming up through our body, whether it be what is labeled as anxiety, depression, fear, trauma, whatever it is. Going back to one of my favorite books, Healing the Soul Wound by Eduardo Duran, he talks about diagnosis as naming ceremony. He says the patient goes through a diagnostic process that she perceives as a naming ceremony that literally gives her an identity of pathology. The patient then takes on the identity of being sick, and in so doing carries the illness being projected by the therapist into her psychological makeup. Last episode, I was talking about how everything is energy. It is. Even Euro-Western science acknowledges that. Those labels, those diagnoses, they have energy. When somebody has a diagnosis placed upon them, that then may be taken in as part of who they are. That diagnosis, let's use a common one, generalized anxiety disorder. Somebody has that label placed upon them, and if they accept that label, they then take on all of the energy that generalized anxiety disorder is connected into. It then becomes this pathology, or there's this thing wrong with me, and I can't do this because of my anxiety, or I can't do this because of my depression. Within the current systems and structures of what would be considered North American society, we are taught to think there's something wrong with me because I have this quote unquote mental illness. That serves a very intentional purpose from a colonial perspective. If I think about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a huge index of all of these various mental illnesses. The DSM is built around ideas of what is considered normal, healthy functioning from a Western Euro-settler colonial paradigm. So the colonial paradigm says this is what it means to be a healthy, functioning member of society. You should be able to excel at certain kinds of intelligence tests. You should be able to perform at a certain level in certain kinds of jobs. You should exhibit certain social traits and characteristics. It's all created around this idea of quote unquote normal. It's created an idea of normalcy that reinforces the current system of colonialism. It is created within the current systems of power, privilege, profit, and patriarchy. If you cannot function in this particular way, make money in this particular way, this system says there is something wrong with you and you have a mental illness or a cognitive disability or one of the many labels that we can find in the DSM. We then have entire systems of psychotherapy, pharmaceuticals that are geared towards correcting somebody's being to fit into what that normal is so that they can then move forth and be a cog in the machine. So there is much intentionality here to say, this is what normal looks like. If you do not fit within this, let us help you fit within this so that you can be a perfectly molded cog in the machine and reinforce the current systems of power, privilege, profit, and patriarchy. Now, I want to be really, really clear. When we zoom out and we realize this is just one worldview, the DSM is simply one worldview among countless worldviews across the globe. And yet this one worldview has been given so much power that people have taken those diagnoses in as though there's something wrong with them. As I said last time, there's nothing wrong with you. We have conversations coming up through our bodies, letting us know that there are things happening in this world that are not okay. Let's use trauma as an example. You may have heard before of the trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, collapse. These are ways that we survive in the face of a traumatic event that is taking place. Now, what happens in nature, let's say you have an elk and a wolf is pursuing that elk to try to get that elk to eat it. If that elk manages to safely escape from the wolf, to not be caught, to not be eaten, that elk will know when they've found a place that they are safe and they are no longer under threat. As soon as they are safe and they are no longer under threat, that elk's body is just going to vibrate. It's going to shake out the survival situation, the traumatic situation, the almost life-threatening situation that just happened. So that elk is going to let its body shake out all of that energy, and that energy is going to go into the land. The land's going to help take care of that. And because of that, that elk walks away without developing what the DSM would label as post-traumatic stress disorder. I remember this one time when I was in my early 20s. I was out late at night in the city with one of my friends, and we were crossing a road, and all of a sudden this car came barreling right towards us, and immediately our survival systems kicked in. Her system kicked in and she froze the same way a deer freezes in the headlights. My survival system kicked in and it was all flight. And thankfully, my flight response also involved grabbing my friend and pulling her off the road with me, so we didn't get hit by the car. What happens after that almost life-threatening incident is right away you notice all that adrenaline in your body, because that adrenaline kicked in as you were in that moment of needing to survive. As humans, we are socialized to just hold it in. So even if our body wants to shake, even if we feel like we want to get up and walk it out and run it out, we might not have the opportunity to, or we might say, oh, no, that's weird, I'm not going to do that. There can be a lot of reasons that we actually don't give our bodies the opportunity to dispel whatever trauma occurred during that survival situation. Maybe we're experiencing trauma regularly and there's actually not many or any moments where we feel safe. We live in a world right now where there is an insurmountable amount of trauma and violence and hurt and pain. And so for somebody who has experienced trauma, it can be very difficult to find that opportunity, that safety to work that trauma out of their bodies. So those quote unquote symptoms are going to come up for that person to let them know, hey, there's something here that I need you to attend to. There's something here I need you to work with. This often is what will bring people into counseling or therapy or seeking other ways to come back to balance. What's unfortunate is that within that mainstream Euro-Western mental health system, when somebody comes in, they are often seen through that paradigm that there's something wrong with you. How can we fix this problem? There's a lot of focus on blaming and shaming the individual. People are told there's something fundamentally wrong with your brain. You have major depressive disorder because you have this imbalance of serotonin and dopamine in your brain. What I find super interesting about that is in 13 years of education in mainstream psychology, I heard over and over and over again, correlation is not causation. What that means is that when we notice a relationship with something, say a relationship between a diagnosis of major depressive disorder and serotonin and dopamine in the brain, that means there's a relationship there, but that doesn't mean the imbalance of serotonin or dopamine is causing the depression. However, often the way that major depressive disorder is treated within the dominating paradigm is, oh, we can fix that imbalance with this medication. I do a lot of workshops, I do a lot of talks, and I often get that question, well, how do you explain the neurological correlates? My response is always, it's a correlation. That is showing up in the brain because that's one of the ways that the brain is showing the conversation that's coming up through that person's body. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that person's neurochemistry. What it means is that their neurochemistry is part of the conversation that's saying, hey, there's something out of balance here. And that imbalance is not within that individual, because from Inuak understandings, Indigenous understandings, we know that it is impossible to be an individual within a box that's completely isolated from everything around us. It's just not possible. And again, I find this interesting because we see research within mainstream Euro-Western psychology that shows mirror neurons, that the neurons in my brain are responding based on that person that I'm sitting in the room with and what's happening in their brain. Our neurons mirror each other. And so again, we have research within the mainstream system that's showing we are actually all connected because our brains are responding to each other. And yet that hasn't translated into the ways that we think about the difficulties that we're experiencing and what we're going through. And this is where it's so helpful to take that step back and to look at the whole, not just what's happening for this person, but what's happening for this person and all of their relations. Let's look outwards. What's happening in the world? So that DSM has been created within a Western Euro-settler paradigm of understanding, within a Western Euro-settler worldview, to say these are the symptoms that mean that you have major depressive disorder. If you have major depressive disorder, here's what we're going to recommend to get you back into that box of what we consider to be normal. Thankfully, there are other worldviews where you have psychologists, where you have service providers looking at the whole person, looking at their systems, looking at families. However, there still tends to be an understanding of pathology, that there's something wrong, perhaps not with the individual, but there's something wrong with their family. It always comes back to this understanding of deficit and pathology, that there's something wrong. Now, that idea that there's something wrong with the person, their family, their community, whatever it may be, is very intentional. Because from a perspective of colonizing, you want people to think there's something wrong with them. Because if people think there's something wrong with them, then they are not necessarily focused in their power. In episode 1, I talked about how we all have the wisdoms, the medicine, the knowledges that we need to heal ourselves, our families, our communities, the world in relationship, because we have our own gifts and power, and we also have the power and gifts of all of those relationships that we're connected into. When we step into our power in that way, not only as individuals, but then as collectives, as families, as communities, it is a major threat to systems of power, privilege, profit, and patriarchy that are currently in place. For thousands and thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have always had ways of working with trauma, of dealing with grief and loss, dealing with anything that can get the best of us, just like that elk who outruns the wolf, who lets that trauma out of their body so that they don't carry it. Indigenous peoples have always had ways of releasing trauma out of our bodies into the land, because trauma, grief and loss, all of those things are part of nature, are part of being a human in this world. For example, there have always been very deep, complex rites of grieving and processing loss. When somebody's physical body passes away, there are ways of supporting the grieving family members that ensured that they didn't have to carry that grief in ways that was hurtful to them. For thousands and thousands of years, Inuak Indigenous peoples have had ways of giving energies to the land that need to be released and let go of so that we do not carry them in our bodies. My ancestors, who were Indigenous to this place, were practicing those ways of giving trauma to the land, of working through trauma, grief, and the difficulties of life in community, with land, in relationship. And what happened when people came to colonize what is now known as North America, we saw this huge increase in death, destruction, trauma, and grief, while at the same time our Inuit Indigenous peoples here were not allowed to continue practicing our ways of living and being with the land, our ceremonies, our traditions, all of those ways that kept us well. So we were losing people at a much higher rate, while at the same time not being able to take care of that grief, take care of that trauma in a good way. And plus, we weren't safe to. In Canada, it was illegal for Inuit Indigenous peoples to practice our cultures, our traditions, our ceremonies until 1960. And in the United States, it was 1978. And so it's really only been recently that our people have been able to use those ways that are thousands and thousands of years old again to help ourselves and our communities. We had people that kept those traditions, cultures, and ceremonies going throughout the time that it was illegal. And that's part of our collective survivance through attempted genocide, that we are still here and we will continue to be here and we are not going anywhere. And not only will we continue to be here, Inuit Indigenous peoples who are alive today are healing the trauma, the grief, the hurt, and the pain of our ancestors that they didn't have the opportunity to because they weren't allowed, because it was illegal, because it was a threat to their life if they did. And the violence and the destruction and the death was just at such a high rate that there was absolutely no way to keep up. So we're here today and we're healing that. And we have these thousands of years old knowledges and wisdoms that we can use to help us in that. Also, the world needs our Inuit Indigenous knowledges more than ever today. We see that when we look around the globe and look at all the crises that are happening globally. And this is where the crow comes in. This is why those crows are coming to us and letting us know you need to change the ways that you are living in relationship with each other as human beings, in relationship with the land, the animals, all of our relatives of the cosmos. Because the ways that we are living right now are out of balance with natural law and with our original instructions. In the first episode, I was talking about the rate of destruction surpassing the rate of regeneration of both the land and ourselves as humans, because we are that reflection of land. Every conversation that's coming through our body that's saying, I'm not feeling well in this world. I am experiencing this deep sadness. I'm experiencing this deep feeling of emptiness, loneliness. I'm experiencing this deep anxiety. We can go into that. We can listen to that the same way Iskotew listened to the crow. And that conversation is going to be interconnected into what is happening in the world today. That conversation is letting us know that's because you need connection again. You need community again. That's because you need to make sure the water is clean. You need to take care of the land so that you're taking clean water into your system and healthy plants into your system, healthy animals into your system. And so all that's coming through our bodies, whether it be what is labeled as a mental health concern or a physical health concern, is simply coming forward to let us know, hey, return to those original ways of knowing, to those original teachings that teach you how to be in good relationship with each other and the land. Parenting is like the best example I've had of living this, where after having my first child, it really hit me how badly we need our communities intact, how much we need each other. We need to support each other. When they say it takes a community to raise a child, it's not just a turn of phrase. It's true. So of course, as a mother, I'm going to feel stressed, overwhelmed, stretched. How can I not when we are meant to be living in community, taking care of each other, helping take care of the kids, having our kids help take care of other kids? How many people who give birth are labeled with that diagnosis of postpartum depression when we can see that the conversation that's coming through that person's body is coming forward to say there are things that are out of balance here. And that can be many different things. There's a lot of birth trauma in the current medical system within North America. Medications that are used that throw people's systems out of balance. And many of us do not have those communities to hold us and to help us in that time after giving birth. And so, of course, that conversation is coming through to say, hey, these are things that should not be happening. I am meant to have more supports at this time. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with that person. That person does not have a mental illness. In fact, that person has wisdom coming through their body that's letting the world know how things need to shift so that we can live in greater balance again. And of course, the DSM also has diagnoses within it that just simply make people's gifts into pathology. When I was doing my dissertation research, I spoke with 16 Inuak Indigenous knowledge holders about how mental health services needed to shift to better serve Inuak Indigenous peoples. Two knowledge holders from different communities brought up Down syndrome as an example of something that today is placed on somebody as a diagnosis, as a pathology, as a disorder, a disability. And both of them pointed out that traditionally in their community, people who were born with what today is diagnosed as Down syndrome, not only were they seen as not having a disorder, they were also seen as having a tremendous and incredible gift for teaching the community about unconditional love, for teaching the community about presence with whatever's happening in the moment, with the beauty of the flower, the beauty of the rainbow. They also didn't deal with the same afflictions of the ego that other members in the community would. Things like jealousy, greed, those things we wrestle with as imperfect human beings navigating this life here. So again, the current mainstream system pathologizes Down syndrome because a person that is given that diagnosis is seen as not being able to fit within that system of power, privilege, profit, patriarchy, the way that the colonial system wants them to. Whereas traditionally, that wouldn't have even been an issue. Diversity has always been embraced by Inuak, by Indigenous peoples. Diversity in ways of thinking and being and seeing and understanding the world, because Inuak, Indigenous peoples, have always understood that we need all of our gifts together as a collective to survive and to thrive in this life, on this planet, with all of our relations. The only time that someone was seen as having some kind of a pathology or something wrong with them was when that person was consistently acting in ways that were harmful to the community of human, other than human, more than human relations. Today, these systems of diagnosis are used as a form of social control. And again, Eduardo Duran, in his book Healing the Soul Wound, talks about the mental health system as a system of social control, because it really is about having people conform to this certain idea of what is normal. And if you're anywhere outside of that, there's something wrong with you. That is not the case. Now, I want to be really clear here. This doesn't mean that we aren't suffering. For instance, when we experience trauma and have that knowledge, that wisdom, that guidance coming through that conversation in our body, that doesn't mean that it's not painful. It's incredibly painful. It's incredibly difficult. It is also bringing us wisdom and knowledge, just the same as Iskotew. That crow was driving her nuts. It was ruining her life. It was interfering with her relationships, with the things that she wanted to do, the life she wanted to live. And it was bringing wisdom and knowledge at the same time. This is the beauty of Inuak Indigenous worldviews. The and that we can acknowledge the whole of it, that something hurts, that it's so difficult, it's terrible, it shouldn't be happening. And we acknowledge there is also wisdom, medicine, and guidance that's coming through that, not just for us as individuals, but for the whole of humanity, especially at this time. Colonial thinking is very boxed thinking. It's very either or, very good or bad. When we come from a colonial way of thinking, we think trauma, bad. Coming from Inuak Indigenous worldviews, we're actually out of that whole paradigm of good versus bad, either or, yes or no, black or white. And we are in a living paradigm of flux and flow of what's happening in the moment. Is it okay that this violence happened? Absolutely not. Is it okay that I experienced this trauma? No. And we're acknowledging the reality is this has happened. This is what you are dealing with. When we're actually practicing therapy from Inuak perspectives, using those Inuak Indigenous psychologies, we have all of our relations, all of land, all of the cosmos to help us in that. I always joke that I'm only like 10% the therapist and the land is like 90% the therapist because you have all the land there that's helping. And then you have all of that person's knowledges and their ancestral wisdoms coming forward and helping. So I'm just here to facilitate and support. And that's my contribution to the medicine, to what is helping that person in that moment. It's really that person's relations, ancestors, the generations to come, all of life and land around that are helping. And it's that land that helps us move through genocide, because the land will take that trauma, that grief, whatever it is that we're dealing with that's getting the best of us, that we need to transform and shift, and it will support us in that way. So coming from those Inuit Indigenous understandings, we know that it's not something that's happening within the individual. It's something that's happening with this entire network of relationships. If that individual is experiencing some kind of quote unquote symptoms because of violence that they experienced, those symptoms are a conversation in many ways. The conversation coming through is coming through to say, this kind of violence is not okay. And this is where you'll see experiences of collective trauma and grief move people to justice. These whole movements where people step forward and say, this is not okay. A great example of that is Muskiki Wellness has been working with the Survivors Circle for Reproductive Justice, Inuit Indigenous survivors of forced and coerced sterilization. These survivors are stepping forward for justice to let the world know this is not okay to be coercing and forcing people to be sterilized. And that's not just happening here, it's happening in other places of the planet. And so those messages are coming through again to guide us towards greater wellness, balance, and living in a good way with one another, and in accordance with natural law and our original instructions. Within Indigenous focusing oriented therapy, which is one of the phrases I've heard our teachers say over and over, is that Inuit Indigenous peoples are not the victims of complex trauma. We are the leaders in complex trauma here today. When you look at the history of colonialism, you look at the colonialism, for example, that the British Empire was enacting before they came over to what is now known as North America, you see that the people that were coming over had already colonized their own. They were heavily traumatized. If you think of that energy of violence, you can use the word energy, you can use the word spirit, if that fits for you, the spirit of violence. That spirit of violence was enacted on their own people, and that spirit of violence was brought over here and enacted upon the Inuit Indigenous peoples of this place. And so you had people that were already violating natural law, that were already violating those ways of living in good relationship with one another, with the land, and with all of our relatives. People who were focused on exploitation, on control, on destruction for the purposes of profit. And you see that legacy continue here today. This is why we have so many conversations coming up through our bodies to say, this is not okay. We cannot be destroying the land at this rate. We cannot be destroying our water, our food systems, everything that we depend on for life at this rate. We cannot be destroying our relationships with other human beings at this rate. And those are the conversations that are coming through our bodies. These Inuit Indigenous wisdoms are the wisdoms that all of humanity needs today for us to move forward, to continue to live, to continue to be on this planet with each other and with all of our relatives of the natural world. One of the knowledge holders in my dissertation work said, when the colonizers first saw us, they thought that we were doing ritual crazy stuff, right? But we were never crazy. We still aren't. And his point in sharing that was to remind us that from the beginning, that colonial system, that colonial worldview and mentality has pathologized our people, has said that there's something wrong with our people, so that they had a justification within themselves to create systems of power, privilege, and oppression to stop us from being who we were, from practicing our traditions, our cultures, our ceremonies, our languages that gave us the incredible power that we had and that we still have today. And so we still see these diagnostic labels today are applied at much higher rates among communities that are marginalized and oppressed by the dominating Euro-colonial system. Not just Inuit, not just Indigenous peoples, but many peoples of color, gender diverse, you name it. These labels are placed upon us at disproportionate rates so that we take in that message that there's something wrong with us and we stifle our own power, our own abilities to heal ourselves, our communities, and the world through engaging those medicines, those wisdoms, those messages that are coming through, whatever it is that's getting the best of us in that moment. These Inuak Indigenous understandings also help us to take a step back and actually honor the ways that we survive through trauma. To see that if I went into a freeze or a collapse mode when I was violently attacked, that was part of me surviving that violent attack. In that moment, I was simply transforming into something, say the mouse that's playing dead, so that I survived that experience of violence. Because I turned into the mouse, I survived that experience of violence. And that is something to be honored. That is not a pathology. That is something that helped me to be here today. And so today, I might notice myself in different situations where something about that situation resembles that violence in some way. And I might notice myself start to turn into collapse into the mouse. And maybe that's a situation where I don't need to do that anymore. And that's where we can become aware of, oh, wait a minute, I'm collapsing into the mouse here, and I actually don't need to. This is a place where I need to bring forward my voice, express the injustice here because now it's safe to do so. And it could also be a situation where transforming into the mouse again is going to keep me safe. And so whatever it is that we're experiencing, it's just about honoring that form of survivance. It's about honoring those ways that we shift and we transform and we make it through those things that may be trying to kill us, literally, or in other ways that may not be physical, but are trying to oppress and suppress and harm us. So whatever those conversations are that are coming through our bodies, the world needs that knowledge. It is knowledge that the world needs that's letting us know, hey, something's not right here. We're out of balance as a collective. And just remembering and keeping in mind that we are so interconnected, we are so relational, we are so vicarious that what's coming through your body may not even be yours at all. You might be experiencing an anxiety that has nothing to do with you, but is an anxiety that you picked up from someone else. Another great example of this is if we think about grief. So a family loses a loved one. You might notice that one family member is crying all the time. Another family member is just raging angry that that person passed away. Another person doesn't seem to be sad, angry, or too emotional at all. They're just doing all the tasks that need to be done. They're getting the groceries, they're organizing the funeral. And if you look at that, that's how the whole family gets taken care of. You have someone that's taking care of all the tears, that's crying all the tears for the family. That means the other family members don't need to cry the tears. They're helping look after that. You have that other family member that's taking all the anger for everyone so that the other people don't have to experience the anger. They are the one that's discharging that anger, that's moving that anger through. And then you have the other family member that's getting things done, that's making sure there's still food on the table, that all the to-do list is getting complete. They are taking care of those practical tasks for the family. So everybody in that situation is taking care of the grief together by taking care of a piece of it. And that's what we do because we are vicarious, because we are connected and collective, and we look after each other in that way. I always think of those laws of physics that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred and transformed. So if I pick up some anxiety for somebody, that means they're carrying less anxiety because some of that anxiety has transferred, and we can transform that energy. And the land helps us to make those transformations. So maybe I take that particular anxiety to the dirt by putting my hands in the dirt and asking the dirt to help me with that and to take that. And the dirt will take that. And those regenerative processes that take place in the soil are going to take care of that energy of anxiety, and they are going to shift it and renew it and put it out as fresh, clear, life-giving energy. This is why it can be very therapeutic sometimes to go into the woods and just let out whatever it is that's bothering us to the trees. We let out that carbon dioxide from our breath, from our words. The trees take that in through photosynthesis. They create oxygen. They clear it up for us. They transform it for us. And so the land is always here and it's always ready to help us because it's always engaging in that healing. We are not hurting the land by leaning into the land to help us with our grief, hurt, pain, whatever it may be, because the land can hold that and shift it and transform it easily. We are hurting the land when we are being destructive and exploitative and disrespectful to the land. And again, violating those natural laws of good relationship. And so just knowing that those conversations come forward for that healing, for justice, for wellness, for balance with all of our relatives, and how important it is to zoom out and come out of those dominating colonial paradigms of mental health that make us feel like there's something wrong with us, that we're less than, and that we are messed up in some way. We are not. Coming out of that individual, knowing whatever it is I am experiencing is connected to what humanity is experiencing, what my family's experiencing, what the land is experiencing. Understanding that there's ancestral hurt and pain that's coming forward, saying, hey, take care of me now because I didn't get to shift and transform this energy when I was alive. But now it's safe for you to, oh, Carly, it's safe for you to go to ceremony. Please take care of this hurt for me. And I've had that experience before of actually releasing trauma that one of my ancestors experienced and being able to look after that for her in ceremony so that that energy was shifted and released. And again, just acknowledging that whatever it is that helped us survive through whatever traumas, loss, hurt, and pain we've experienced is something to be honored, and that we can honor that. And at the same time, we can work to shift, transform, and heal that in ways that not only help us, but they help our families, our communities, humanity, and the world. And the good news in all of this is that we also share the healing, shifting, and transforming with those around us. And so we can be looking after something, shifting something, coming into greater balance with something. And those ripples of wellness and balance are going to also move through our networks of relationships. Those acts of psycholonization, of enacting colonialism through mental health practice, through pathologizing people's experiences, reinforces colonialism through shutting people down, through silencing them. There are psychological and psychiatric treatments and interventions that are all about silencing whatever the conversations are that are coming through someone's body, or even silencing and shutting down people's gifts, which I'll talk about in a later episode. When we shift out of those colonial ways of understanding mental health and wellness, we're no longer trying to shut down the conversation that's coming through our body. Instead, it's opening up to listening to those conversations and engaging the medicine and wisdom that's coming through. We're moving from a place of patronizing someone, of, oh, you poor thing, I can't believe you went through that, to coming to a place of honoring what that person has been through. You survived a lot. What happened to you is not okay. You're validating that, and you're acknowledging that person's strength, that person's power, and you're not making them small. Psycholonization involves patronizing people, making them small, making them powerless, and that somehow the clinician is better than that person because there's something wrong with them, but not with me, and I'm here to help with that. Inuak understandings involve coming out of that and acknowledging and honoring what someone has been through and all of the wisdoms and medicines that help them through that, and that will continue to help them as they move toward greater balance and wellness for them. These diagnostic systems currently maintain and sustain multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical and insurance industries. There is a lot of money in us believing that there's something wrong with us, in us receiving these diagnoses, in us thinking that there is something wrong with us and that we need all of these various things to help correct whatever that is that's wrong with us. There is a lot of money in that, and there is also a lot of power, privilege, and oppression that is maintained and sustained by that. And so in my perspective, the DSM serves the purpose in the current system of getting people the supports and resources that they need. I have worked in positions before where I have been obligated to diagnose people with a mental disorder out of the DSM. Anytime I am in that position, I make it very clear, this does not mean that you have this diagnosis. These diagnoses are social socially constructed ideas within one particular worldview that is saying how you should or shouldn't be in the world. The usefulness of this diagnosis is just to get you the resources and supports that you need because the system is the way it is right now. It does not mean that there's something wrong with you. And so whenever I've been in a position where I have to give diagnoses for that reason, I view it as diagnostic harm reduction. How do we, as much as possible, reduce the harm of this diagnosis and diagnostic process and just use it simply for the purpose that it's needed to support this person getting those resources and supports that they need, while knowing that they don't actually have that diagnosis, because that diagnosis is socially constructed within one way of thinking. At the end of the day, we've all been taught to think that there's something wrong with us, that whatever that thing is that's wrong with us, we need somebody's help to fix it. It is not us as individuals who need fixing. It is the current colonial systems and structures, the systems of power, privilege, profit, and patriarchy that are out of alignment with natural law, that are out of alignment with original instructions and right relationship, and that require that shifting, that balancing, that healing to come full circle back to Inuit Indigenous knowledges and ways of living, knowing, being, and doing. Those knowledges will help us to continue to live and be on this planet in relation in the best way possible. Inuit Indigenous wisdoms are the wisdoms that the world needs today. It's really important in this to be careful not to co-opt an Indigenous identity. Listen to the voices of Inuit Indigenous peoples today who still have their teachings, who still have their ways of knowing, being, and doing, and listen to what those voices are saying about living in relation with the earth, with the land, with each other in a good way. Listening with that humility, returning to those original instructions, those original teachings, because every human being, no matter who you are, where you're from, and whether or not you know where your ancestors are from, can live in good relationship with other people, with land, water, air, animals, all of our relatives. Connect into your roots, connect back to those teachings. Hi. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you on the next full moon.